I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And this is our podcast on the Muppets, who have done a great many things over the years. There was a time, a very, very long time ago, when all I knew of the Muppets was the Muppet Babies cartoon. And actually, I don't now remember very much about it or how much I enjoyed it. But I realised what it was, and more or less what the Muppets really were, from a clip to try and persuade us to buy some sort of Muppets video on the end of one of our Disney videos. So Disney already had their claws in them. A clip with Kermit and Miss Piggy, something to do with their will they, won't they romance that they're always having, or characters that they're playing always allude to.
Yes, they were attempting to look after some babies, weren't they?
I'll make a wonderful mother someday. I thought, that's Kermit and Miss Piggy, isn't it? They're grown-up puppets. And then I thought, oh, Muppet Babies. You're meant to already know the Muppet grown-ups, and this is them.
We mentioned Muppet Babies way back on one of our early podcasts because we watched it as part of Going Live. Unlike you, I was aware of the grown-up Muppets. I noticed the Muppet Show being on and found the theme tune rather catchy. But I definitely preferred Muppet Babies. I don't think I really engaged with the grown-up Muppets on the Muppet Show tonight. And one thing I did quickly notice was that Skeeter was extra for Muppet Babies. I recognised all the other Muppet Babies as baby versions of grown-up Muppets from the Muppet Show, whereas obviously Skeeter is a female version of Scooter, which I suppose they'd added to the show to have another female character. I was reading an interview with one of the Muppet performers quite recently who said perhaps Skeeter was intended to be a more psychologically balanced female character than the other main female character on Muppet Babies, Piggy. It turns out Muppet Babies actually has 8 seasons. I'm not sure how much of it we actually saw on Going Live. Muppet Babies used to include bits of old film and sometimes not so old film to represent imagination in the nursery, and the part where a couple of the characters are interacting with the Jim Henson Creature Workshop mice from the 1990 version of The Witches must come quite late on in the run of Muppet Babies.
I didn't realise that it wasn't always at the level of Muppet Christmas Carol, Muppet Treasure Island, which we'll go into in more detail. When I was most aware of the Muppets, I'd seen those two things. Muppets Tonight, when I was about 11, 12, was on weekly on Friday evenings, and it was as much as I expected from a half-hour thing just for fun. And the last 15 or 20 minutes or so of Muppets Take Manhattan, which we found playing one of our tapes of Sooty or something through to the end, and it was making us both laugh. When I saw in their TV premieres from around that time Muppets from Space and It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas Movie, I thought, oh, this isn't up to the usual standard, but actually they probably were. Later in life I managed to see the Muppet movie, their first movie, and The Great Muppet Caper, and they really made me realise, oh, Jake's right about the Muppets, they're not normally that good.
As a consequence of how I felt about the Muppet Show versus Muppet Babies, I was actively surprised by how much I did enjoy the Muppet Christmas Carol. And after I got really into that and Muppet Treasure Island, I thought, well, perhaps I do like the Muppets after all. But then after that, coming into things like Muppets Tonight in 1996, Muppets from Space, which was on telly a few years later, that Christmas movie, all the things you listed, I realised, yeah, I was right in the first place. I don't like the Muppets. And those two films, Muppet Christmas Carol and Muppet Treasure Island, really are something very special.
Now, the Muppet performers are all very good, and when they get good material, they can make a lot of it. A very interesting thing about Muppets Take Manhattan is it shows that Steve Whitmire can take over as the voice of Kermit should anything happen to Jim Henson, and in fact something did happen to Jim Henson. In the story, Kermit has amnesia and he's separated from the other Muppets and gets involved with a group of frog business people. And I think one of them's a lady frog who I can't really remember. And then two of them are Dave Goelz and Steve Whitmire doing a Kermit voice, imitating what Jim Henson does in order to sound like frogs. Now, Dave Goelz sounds sort of like Gonzo doing something a bit strange with his throat, and Steve Whitmire sounds almost exactly like Kermit. And with a little bit of work, after Jim Henson was no longer with us, he was able to sound exactly like Kermit.
Steve Whitmire's sort of pet character, the one he really developed, characterised on the Muppet Show, was Rizzo the Rat. And when we watched Muppet Christmas Carol for the first time, I don't think either of us were expecting to see Rizzo and thought, oh, here's a new character, sort of sidekick for Gonzo. But as it turned out, he wasn't brand new. Of course, that is where Steve Whitmire does voice Kermit for the first time. Muppet Christmas Carol, 1992, a couple of years after Jim Henson prematurely died. It's also the first Muppet thing which was produced by Walt Disney. They haven't completely taken it over yet, but they are, as you said, getting their claws into it. And that's why, when you get the VHS release of Cinderella from around that time, the early 90s, they're encouraging you to buy Muppet videos. Another thing that struck me about Muppet Christmas Carol, speaking of Dave Goelz, was that Gonzo's voice seemed a little different to me. If you look it up, you can easily discover Dave Goelz is and always has been Gonzo, and indeed, for the past 20 years, Dave Goelz is the one member of the original trio, Jim Henson, Frank Oz and Dave Goelz, who were trying to turn the Muppets as a franchise, a faction, into something after their initial work on Sesame Street, trying to launch Kermit and some supporting characters into a thing that was going to develop and be popular and have its own show. And of course the US didn't really buy into that. It was ITV in this country that commissioned the Muppet Show. But if you hear Dave Goelz's initial performance as Gonzo from the 70s or 80s, Gonzo's voice does sound much less like a normal human voice. It sounds more like it does on Muppet Babies, kind of a sort of raspy, high, put-on voice. And really, for the first time in Muppet Christmas Carol, Dave Goelz does tone that down, I guess to make it more sustainable as he gets older, which is very understandable, particularly as he has kept doing it ever since. At the time of this podcast, he's certainly in his late 70s and still doing any Gonzo that comes up and any other Muppet performances. Dave Goelz is the one who has always stuck with the Muppets and obviously loves them dearly, Gonzo in particular, I'm sure, no matter which company is buying it, making it, and what nonsense they might be doing with it. That doesn't matter to Dave Goelz, unlike Frank Oz, who ducked out of the whole thing by 2005, The Muppet Wizard of Oz, when Disney really had got their claws into the whole franchise.
And he won't be Yoda for Disney either.
That's right, he has a real problem with Disney. And we were noticing, watching Muppet Treasure Island quite recently, he has to be and Frank Oz and have executive producer credit before he'll give Disney the time of day. So, perhaps the sad story of Bobby Driscoll is something Frank Oz has very close to his heart, as well as something that snuck onto our Alice in Wonderland podcast.
As we keep implying, Muppet Christmas Carol and The Muppets Treasure Island are the two films that really are close to both our hearts. Muppet Wizard of Oz finishes a trilogy in a way and is rather different in other ways. A Christmas Carol stars Michael Caine as Ebenezer Scrooge, and really the way it works is that he's playing it absolutely straight, and a couple of supporting human actors, most notably nephew Fred and his wife Clara, are also playing it very straight, and the Muppets are doing some emotional bits. The death of Tiny Tim is floods of tears time, for instance, and also doing amusing, funny, wacky Muppet stuff.
It's an interesting world it creates. some people are humans, some are Muppets, and they just kind of coexist, and that's the way things are in the world. And it works really well in those two movies, which, just to skip ahead a little, is why I find it weird in The Muppet Wizard of Oz that the Muppets themselves, as a franchise or faction, appear to exist in the same world with Dorothy and Candace, and appear as Oz characters in her otherworld experience.
Muppet Treasure Island, it's true, does do the same sort of thing. It really struck me this time when we watched it. A difference is that the human actors aren't always playing it straight. Jennifer Saunders is there, being funny and wacky and outlandish all the time, as Mrs. Gloveridge, who replaces Jim Hawkins' mother. He's an orphan. Billy Connolly is being funny as Billy Bones pretty much all the time. He also has to be in fear of his life and set up the whole treasure map thing, which is fairly serious. Tim Curry as Long John Silver is brilliant. I think Tim Curry can be very brilliant, and he can be a bit lackluster depending on the material that he's given and how well he gels with the rest of the cast. And he's brilliant as Long John Silver. Does some serious stuff, does some funny, wacky Muppet stuff. And I remember first seeing that film thinking, well, what about Jim? Who's playing Jim? Is he going to be the right age? And can he possibly be good enough to play Jim Hawkins and play him alongside Muppets? And I was rather sceptical, and up it came, and introducing Kevin Bishop as Jim Hawkins. Kevin Bishop is absolutely brilliant as Jim Hawkins. And I've never seen another actor who I thought really was quite right as Jim Hawkins. They're too old, they're too young, they're lacking a bit of the X factor. They certainly don't have as much X factor as Kevin Bishop.
Yes, they do make a wonderful choice of human cast in both those movies. I hadn't really particularly been aware of Michael Caine before we watched Muppet Christmas Carol, but I thought he was absolutely wonderful in it. I remember once I was watching it on video and it was getting towards the end of the movie, and our mum came in and said, "Is that Michael Caine?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is he singing?" I said, "Yes, he is." Didn't seem like such a strange thing to me, a very appropriate thing for Ebenezer Scrooge to be doing at this stage of the movie. But of course, she was more used to him as a gangster and that sort of thing. You were only supposed to blow the bloody doors off. But I had absolutely no concept of that. In the opening of Muppet Christmas Carol, I liked how Gonzo was appearing as Charles Dickens to narrate the story and also kind of be involved in the story. I thought that worked very well. Rizzo backing him up, as I said, as a kind of sidekick was very entertaining. The two of them do perform the same kind of role in Muppet Treasure Island, except it's the Great Gonzo and Rizzo the Rat as themselves. I was kind of expecting something like the Great Gonzo as Robert Louis Stevenson and Rizzo the Rat as himself. Then it would be exactly the same. But in this case, they've kind of split Jim into three characters, and it doesn't take anything away from Kevin Bishop's Jim, because he is Jim completely. But he has these two companions, Gonzo and Rizzo, who work with him at the inn and go with him on the ship, and aren't anyone in the story except Jim's companions. And I've always kind of thought, it's a bit of a shame Gonzo's not Robert Louis Stevenson, but perhaps they wanted to do something a bit different there, and it works well enough, having Gonzo and Rizzo around in the same way, doing the same kind of wacky things, but not as narrators.
As you were remarking, it means they do get to interact with the other characters, which works well. I think one thing that the Treasure Island film could do without is Rizzo's Caribbean cruise with all the other rats that you often see, providing backup to Rizzo, being tourists and going around taking pictures and complaining about the paint on the shuffleboard court. I don't find it funny, the film really doesn't need it, but at the same time it's fairly innocuous. There isn't anything I would say that about in A Christmas Carol. I think that's all very well judged, and I think the human characters, actors, playing it all straight works for that film, and I think the human actors being comedy characters works for Treasure Island.
If I had a favourite Muppet when I was little, even though I didn't really like the Muppet Show, I'd have said that my favourite character from that and Muppet Babies was Fozzie the Bear. I guess I just kind of liked the look of him as a kind of teddy bear. I don't think I really engaged with his unfunny comedian role. But I was kind of disappointed by the level of his involvement in Muppet Christmas Carol. He's not in it that much. His name works quite well, Fozzie the Bear as Fozziewig. But I was quite pleased that he was in Muppet Treasure Island more as Squire Trelawney. And really, all the Muppet characters are well cast in the roles from the literature. Not only Fozzie Bear as Fozziewig and the great Gonzo as Charles Dickens, but also Kermit and Miss Piggy as the Cratchits works very well, alluding to their, as you mentioned earlier, will they, won't they, on-off romance. And something very similar happens in Muppet Treasure Island, with Kermit the Frog as Captain Smollett and Miss Piggy as Benjamina Gunn, adapted from the marooned castaway character Ben Gunn quite effectively as Captain Smollett's old flame.
And in The Wizard of Oz, just when you think, well, they're not going to be able to get the Kermit Miss Piggy romance into this one, are they? It's practically finished. The Witch of the South starts making eyes at the Scarecrow when they meet towards the end.
I noticed in Muppet Christmas Carol that not all the Muppets I was familiar with were actually there. I suppose I was thinking of Scooter. I wasn't expecting Skeeter because I knew she was only in Muppet Babies. But I thought, oh, Scooter could have been in this, and he's not. You get a cameo from Rolf at the piano, and of course I hadn't realised at that point that it was policy that Rolf was never going to speak again after the death of Jim Henson. So I thought, well, I guess they've included him in a cameo like they do with Animal, playing instruments where appropriate. But they haven't put Scooter in it. They couldn't find a place for him. They couldn't find a place for him in Muppet Treasure Island either. So then when Scooter does turn up in Muppet Wizard of Oz, I think, oh, goodness me, there's something they've made an effort to do, get Scooter into one of these for once. An interesting thing about Muppet Treasure Island in comparison to Muppet Christmas Carol is that you can see some of the Muppets who are about to be in, who are planned for, who have been made for, really. Muppets Tonight, I think particularly of the lobster character, who's called Polly the Lobster in Treasure Island, because he's taking on the role of a pirate's parrot. Obviously, if it was exactly like the original Treasure Island, Long John Silver's lobster would be called Captain Flint. But I guess that wouldn't show the parrot parallel quite so well. And there's also Clueless, who's a kind of horned beast, a goat, who is, as his name implies, rather clueless.
It's a very amusing roll call. Clueless Morgan, Polly Lobster, Old Tom, Real Old Tom, Dead Tom, that Sam Eagle is reading out before they set sail on the Hispaniola.
They struggled a bit to get Sam Eagle into Muppet Wizard of Oz. He appears very briefly as a doorman, with Eric Jacobson not really managing to capture the old Frank Oz Sam Eagle voice. Certainly not nearly so well as he does with Miss Piggy and Fozzie. I remember being interested watching Muppet Treasure Island to spot, they've given Sam Eagle a real proper role in this as Mr. Arrow. Like Fozzie, he had a much smaller role in Muppet Christmas Carol as the headmaster, really only appearing in the Ghost of Christmas Past flashback.
As you say, Eric Jacobson can imitate Miss Piggy and Fozzie very well. I do think it's fair to say that because Frank Oz was doing Muppets with all the others for so many years, Eric Jacobson doesn't quite fit in the same way. He's marching to a slightly different beat. And you're kind of thinking, well, Frank Oz would have been more in sync with the others. And I noticed the same thing when Rizzo and Fozzie were on This Morning cooking something with Gino, and Kermit and Miss Piggy did an interview with Philip Schofield and Holly Willoughby, if that's who it was in those days. And Eric Jacobson was doing the best that anybody could to be Fozzie and to be Miss Piggy and to be amusing. He was just marching to a slightly different beat from Kermit and from Rizzo.
Bunsen and Beaker, too, have a more extended role in Muppet Treasure Island. In the Christmas Carol, they played the charitable gentlemen, who really appear towards the beginning and the end. They too appear throughout Treasure Island as Dr. Livesey and his assistant Beaker.
I think Beaker is hilarious. He's got such a funny looking face, and when he talks he says "Nee, nee, 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 nee," and his mouth is moving in this funny way, and I think as a visually humorous puppet, Beaker is extremely successful.
Muppet Wizard of Oz uses even more named Muppets than Treasure Island did. All those ones we've mentioned have roles in Wizard of Oz. Bunsen and Beaker, for example, are technicians at the Emerald City. They try to persuade you to wear your glasses so that the optical illusions can take place. There's at least a couple of Muppets that I think debuted on Muppets Tonight that turn up in Wizard of Oz. The monkey Sal and his companion, who's the sort of slick movie star Johnny something or other. And the rest of the Flying Monkeys biker gang, you can see them around on Muppets Tonight. Also Clifford, who I wasn't familiar with at all before Muppets Tonight. He was the host of Muppets Tonight. Apparently he did hang around being in the band with Animal and everyone before that, but Muppets Tonight was really where Clifford became a prominent character. And that was actually a problem I had with Muppets Tonight, even though I hadn't liked the Muppet Show. The sense of not wanting things to be too different was strong in me then at the age of 13. And I thought some of the newer Muppets were ousting the Muppets I was familiar with from Muppets Tonight. Clifford was the main presenter instead of Kermit. You only saw Kermit, Miss Piggy, Fozzie, Gonzo, occasionally contributing something. I think of the Muppets featured prominently in Muppet Christmas Carol, the one that features most prominently in Muppets Tonight is actually Rizzo, who was doing a lot of behind-the-scenes gopher work with his clipboard, as it were, like he used to do on the Muppet Show. And he was contributing a lot to Muppets Tonight. For example, the scene that we've always remembered and did enjoy at the time, where he's doing a kind of secret microphone link with the bear security guard, and through various errors of timing and judgment ends up getting the bear to say to the hot female guest, Cindy Crawford, "That's a nice set of balloons you've got there. Maybe you'll let me play with them later," which was very near the knuckle humour for 6 o'clock on BBC Two on a Friday night, and very amusing.
I think really we've listed the reasons and qualified what I said about Muppet Wizard of Oz being a bit different from the other two. And it was only a TV movie, very tentative sort of toe in the water there, wasn't it? And I don't think it's as funny, as original as Christmas Carol and Treasure Island. I think it's engaging. I think it works well as an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. There are obvious differences, changes they've made. Dorothy and Aunt Em and Uncle Henry are modern day residents of Kansas, running Aunt Em's diner, living in a trailer park, and perhaps that makes it more believable when the house blows away than when it's a regular house.
Oh, Pepe the Prawn, of course, as Toto. That's a huge debutant from Muppets Tonight.
So, in fact, Toto becomes a prawn who goes from being an actual prawn in a goldfish bowl to being a Muppet when they get to Oz. That's very different from Toto in the book. But at the same time, they've taken a lot of inspiration from the book, such as they bother with all 4 witches, unlike which one inevitably will compare it to the Judy Garland MGM classic, all played by Miss Piggy, their 4 sisters. The Flying Monkeys, only of which Sal is a monkey, I think, being controlled by a magic hat. In this case, it's a magic biker cap. And Ashanti as Dorothy, more of a sort of grown-up young adult Dorothy than in the book, does that thing that we approve of, giving the item that enslaves the magical race to the leader of that race so that they will be their own master. And in the book, in fact, Glinda says she is going to do that after she's got the Flying Monkeys to do 3 things.
We've always had a Ladybird book, which is a good kind of succinct version of L. Frank Baum's original Wizard of Oz story. And I don't know if I mentioned on the Wizard of Oz podcast, but even watching Judy Garland and Friends for the first time, I was comparing it to that Ladybird book. The Tin Man in this film was made by a tinsmith. He wasn't originally a human that the Wicked Witch of the West has turned into a Tin Man. The Emerald City really is an Emerald City. They're not going around with glasses on and finding out that it's an optical illusion at the end. And when I watched The Muppet Wizard of Oz for the first time, that really was what struck me most. It is a lot more like the book, the Ladybird book. I hadn't read the original at the time, but it is pretty true to the original, the Ladybird book, than Judy Garland's movie, because they have those things that I just mentioned. Gonzo takes the trouble to tell us, as the tin thing, that he used to be a living creature, not human in this case, but a living blue whatever he is, that the Wicked Witch of the West has turned into the tin thing.
Which is a sort of a robot in this adaptation.
As soon as they got to the Emerald City, they were putting the glasses on. Bonson's coming in when they're discovering that it's all a sham and going, no, you must wear the glasses. It burns, it burns. I think, yes, that's the same thing as in the Ladybird book. Thank goodness. That means, I thought, they'll put in all 4 witches. And they did. As you mentioned, they really don't need the Good Witch of the South in Muppet Wizard of Oz any more than they do in Judy Garland's Wizard of Oz. She's not in the South. She's in the East with the Munchkins and the Good Witch of the North. But I was pleased that they did bother to put all 4 witches in. You even get to see more of the Wicked Witch of the East than just her feet when she lifts the house up briefly.
Speaking of Munchkins, that's Rizzo and these supporting rats that I mentioned, and they are amalgamated in The Muppet Wizard of Oz with the mice who carry Dorothy and Toto and the lion away from the narcotic poppies. It's happening in a nightclub called Poppy Fields, so you can see there how it's in some ways true to the book and in some ways wacky and different and Muppet-fied. Another thing from the book that Judy Garland didn't do is all go in to see the wizards separately, that Ashanti, Gonzo as Tin Thing, Kermit as the Scarecrow, and Fozzie as the Cowardly Lion do. And our Ladybird book nicely illustrates what L. Frank Baum wrote. They each see a different vision. The wizard takes a different shape. Dorothy gets a big green head, which is the one they use for Judy Garland, which is kind of embellished and stylised for Ashanti. It looks like the sort of ogre Disney doing their animation with Pixar there. The other 3 things are kind of swapped round. In the book, Scarecrow gets a beautiful woman, and Tin Man gets a scary monster, and Lion gets a ball of fire. And with the Muppets, Lion got a scary monster, which worked quite well for him being cowardly. He was frightened of it. Scarecrow got the ball of fire, and Tin Thing got the beautiful woman. He didn't really like the beautiful woman, so she changed into a chicken, and it's been in the back of my mind the whole time. I must mention that Gonzo, though he isn't a chicken himself, fancies chickens, and that's totally consistent from the Muppet Show right through to The Wizard of Oz, which is the last thing I have any time for. Muppets from Space actually tells you that he's an alien and he meets other people from his home planet. And why does he fancy chickens then? Because it's funny.
Another thing that Christmas Carol and Treasure Island definitely have over Wizard of Oz is the songs. We were very struck right from the first watching with how good the songs were in Christmas Carol, and the ones in Treasure Island certainly do live up to those. But really, there's no musical number in Muppet Wizard of Oz that either of us, I think, finds at all catchy, memorable, or good in any way.
Kevin Bishop's a talented singer as well as actor, of course. In Muppet Treasure Island, it's a bit Westminster Abbey, boy soprano, not very characterful. I don't know if that's because it was just the kind of singing that he had been taught, or if it was meant to represent innocence or anything.
Similarly, Tim Curry has a very particular style of singing there that probably isn't his natural natural singing voice when he is singing with an ensemble cast, singing with Jim as part of Sailing for Adventure. So when Long John Silver describes when you're a professional pirate as my only number, Tim Curry is quite right. That's the only song he really gets to sing in character with a singing voice that comes more naturally to him, I would say.
And this Westminster Abbey boy soprano stuff doesn't really allow Jim to sing as Jim. But if you want to hear people singing as a character, goodness me, listen to the Muppet performers singing. And that's another thing that works extremely well about their performances.
The bit where I've always thought it's kind of a shame that Jim's been made to sing in that way is very early on. The song that's kind of about him and his hopes and aspirations for the future, wanting to set out on a great adventure and not rot in the inn forever. And I guess having Gonzo and Rizzo backing him up, singing very characterfully there, does help with that, because they're all kind of encompassing Jim's character.
Of course, Ashanti has a particular style of singing. Dorothy's motivation is not really to go home, it's to become a famous singer. And then she learns that it's more important to be with your family and all that kind of thing. And I do remember thinking her voice doesn't really blend with the Muppets very well. And when they're all singing together about what they want from the wizard, it's just something that you might notice. Though I wouldn't say it was detrimental.
I always find myself thinking something like, and I don't think I've ever really formed it into a full thought while watching Muppet Wizard of Oz, Disney could have shoved in a young singing star they had without really thinking about it, and she wouldn't really fit that well with the Muppets, and it wouldn't kind of work. Fortunately, I don't think that is what's happened, despite the fact that she doesn't gel with them when they're singing. It always strikes me that Ashanti, as this Dorothy talking to the Muppets, does actually work quite well. So clearly she put a lot into it.
So Disney didn't do too badly there, and then they went on and they made this theatrically released film called The Muppets, and I was curious to see it, and one day I did, and it was dreadful. It wasn't like the older stuff, which was just, this isn't speaking to me, or even this isn't hitting the notes that it's going for. It was offensively bad. The plot was contrived and self-conscious. The jokes were painful. The songs were rather forgettable. And then the crowning turd in the water pipe, Ralph spoke. How irreverent is that? He was supposed to never speak again out of respect for Jim Henson. So after that, I haven't watched any other Muppet stuff that Disney have done.
So there's an end to all our thoughts on the Muppets. And what we'll take forward with us, as you may have gathered, is a great fondness for Muppet Christmas Carol and Treasure Island, and an acceptance of Wizard of Oz as the third one in that kind of literary adaptation trilogy, with things that we genuinely do enjoy about it. Join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in June, for our penultimate regular podcast, which will be about something that has been mentioned several times on these podcasts. David Suchet in the role of Agatha Christie's Poirot on ITV. Until then,
good night out there.
Whatever you are.